I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for being here tonight. I'm René Paul Barilleaux, Head of Curatorial Affairs here at the McNay, and I'm delighted to be joined by Letscher for this conversation. So Lance and I are going to have a very informal conversation about his work and about the kind of the process, the inspiration, and what motivates him to be an artist. And so we're going to start by just looking at this collage, Funny Hat. This is in the McNay's collection. I wanted to put this first because many of you who are kind of our regular members and audience probably know this collage. We purchased it in about 2010, and it was the first significant purchase of Lance's work that we made. And it's been just a kind of a crowd pleaser ever since. But before that, after that, we also acquired other work, earlier work of Lance's. And a lot of people don't associate this work with the work they see in the galleries today. This work came into the collection after Funny Hat. It came from a private collection, but you can see how early it is from 1989. And I thought it was a good starting point here to talk about your biography. For those people who don't know you, where you're from, where you went to school, just kind of the basic biography so we sort of can position you in sort of like, and how this came to be.
I got my graduate and undergraduate degrees at University of Texas. I graduated in 1989, and this is from about, I think, 86, something like that. Pretty early on, I was doing a lot of sculpture, and mostly wood and iron and steel. And this is a kind of an unusual standout piece in that it's the only fabric piece that I've ever done.
And where were you from originally?
Austin.
And you still live in Austin?
Yeah.
And did you live anywhere else in between?
I've lived in Nebraska for 6 months, but just Austin, pretty much just Austin.
And when you see this piece, does this bring back memories for you for this time?
Yeah, there was a gallery in Dallas called North Number Zero, and I had a couple of shows there in the early 80s and mid 80s, and this was one of the pieces that was in that show.
So the exhibition we're presenting, Homes and Gardens, it shows a very specific kind of slice of your work, very specific themes in your work. And could you talk about why those themes sort of resonate now and here, and how we arrived at sort of putting those two bodies of work together for this exhibition?
Well, I do a lot of, over the past several years, I've focused a lot on landscape architecture and gardening in my work. So I make small gardens, and a lot of times buildings are incorporated as well, and usually those are symbolic of studios or buildings under construction, like future studios. So that's kind of the two components.
And the structures, are some of those real places, or are they all mostly imagined places?
Mostly imagined.
Mm-hmm. And the gardens as well?
Mostly imagined, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this work is not in the exhibition, but you mentioned to me that it was very kind of pivotal in the development of your collage. So we're looking at something from the mid-1990s. You've been out of school for probably almost 8 years, 6 years or so.
7 years, yeah. Yeah, I was doing stone carving and carving a lot of marble, and that's very labor intensive and super time consuming, and there were large pieces, so they were very heavy, but they were also very delicate, so they were very fragile. And I kind of worked myself into a crisis where I wasn't getting shows and I wasn't getting shown. And so I started doing these pieces similar to this that were based on drawings that I would cut out and superimpose one on the other to create space. And that was the beginning of doing collage for me. It was in 1995, I think, 90 or so, and this is 96. This is one of the really early pieces.
And it looks like it's on an open book.
It's it's probably end pages.
Mm-hmm. Book pages, and we kind of see the spine in the center.
Yes.
And so you were using this botanical imagery. Was that coming from the marble carving pieces at all, or is it totally?
Yeah, somewhat, and also just I like to draw visually. I like to, like look at something and draw it. And one thing that really lends itself to that is botanical imagery. I was doing a lot of plants just because of that.
And was that from observation?
Yeah, from observation.
Or not invention?
Not invention.
So in the exhibition, we do have an early example of one of your drawings from 1996. I think this is more of a drawing than a collage. Is that correct?
No, it's a collage. It's drawn, but then it's cut out and collaged.
And the materials you used here?
I was using a lot of Sanka coffee to
as a material?
Yeah, to get the tones that I got, which is probably not archival. It's probably pretty acidic.
Right. And then were you brushing that on, or how were you applying
soaking it, or brushing it, or dipping it, or smearing it with my fingers.
And I'm really intrigued by the composition of this one because of the kind of like, almost like, reminds me a lot of a photograph, the way it's cropped. Is this a real space in your house, or was it something you were observing?
No, but it's a table that I have. We have that table. I built that table. So it was just a drawing from life.
And at this point, were you kind of doing a number of works dealing with kind of still life? Because this is very, when I look at this, it's very uncomplicated, right? It's very open. It's very kind of frontal, but we still see the representational imagery. And did that tie into some of the other work you were doing at the same time?
Very much. Yeah, very much so. There were a lot of very simple objects, and a lot of the objects that I chose were difficult to draw because they were elliptical or because they were cylindrical, or there was a technique challenge to my drawing that drew me to them, that attracted me to them.
And when you're drawing something like this, is it pretty much intuitive? It's just kind of you're moving around the surface of the plane. Do you plot this out ahead of time?
No, my eye moves at the same rate as my pencil moves. I learned how to draw that way, and that's how I do it.
And still draw that way?
Pretty much.
So we're going to jump 20 years.
Yeah.
To a collage. And I want to, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a lot of collages, and we're going to talk about different themes and topics that are evident in your work or about your process. Sometimes they'll be tied to the image on the screen, and sometimes they'll just be a beautiful visual for you to kind of look at while we speak. So I want to talk a little about your studio process. I'm most fascinated by the way artists work in their studio. Some have many assistants, and it's a big production, more like an office full of busy bees. Others work in isolation. So can you talk about how you work and what that looks like and what your studio looks like, and just kind of so we get a little kind of peek inside your world?
The primary aspect of my studio is about a table about this big with a cutting mat, and I sit there and I cut 85% of the time, just cutting out imagery. And the rest of the studio is presses and table space and boxes of old paper, different kinds of paper organized loosely or not organized at all. So it's pretty open space with kind of this very condensed, concentrated, piled area where I work.
And is it adjacent to your house?
Yeah, it is. It's connected to our house.
And as part of your practice, do you work every day?
Yeah, I don't work weekends usually. I work 9 to 4:30 or 5 or so when my wife gets home, and then I quit.
And do you work by yourself, or do you ever work with assistants?
I work by myself.
So we talked a little about the botanical themes, the floral themes. What are some of the other themes that you like to explore in the kind of overall body of your work, besides these, for people who don't know your work?
Well, this piece is actually a metal piece, and the metal pieces are made out of lithographic tin signage and roofing staples. And in this one, there's an area towards the upper right that's just a condensation of wires. and the piece was not successful, and so I continued to work on it and made it into the cactus garden that it turned out to be.
How do you know when to stop?
Intuition.
It just feels right. And the compositions are worked out intuitively as well?
Well, I lay everything out without glue first, and I'll work with a piece for a day or a week or 6 weeks, depending upon the size and the scale and the complexity. And towards the end, I start to try to memorize compositional aspects of it, or color movements, or focal points, multiple focal points. I try to memorize as much of it as I can because I have to take it apart and glue it.
But you don't photograph it?
No, I don't photograph it.
So it's all from memory?
Yeah, I pretty much memorize them as I go. They seem real complex, but they're really not that complex.
And when you see them, like this work presented in the gallery, can you kind of retrace in your mind the steps that you did to get there?
Yeah.
Cool. So I want to talk about like the material, the source for the images. Because so most of this is found imagery, right, that you're recycling.
It is found, yeah.
And where do you locate that? Where do you find that?
I have a lot of friends that deal in ephemera and used paper and books, and I found people on the internet that sell books and sell lithographic reproductions, and I've just kind of over time learned what's available and learned how to find it when I need it. A lot of times if I find something really significant, like I got a book maybe 6 weeks ago called Parrots of the World, and it was 3 inches thick, and it had 750 illustrations, all hand-drawn, of parrots, and that drove the next 5 pieces. So a lot of times the materials that I find informs the work that I do subsequent to finding that.
So would you say it's like you're not like, I want to do a body of work about parrots, then you go out looking for a parrot book?
No, it's the other way around.
Okay, so the source material drives the imagery. That's really interesting. So that it's not that you're not looking for things, but it's coming to you, sort of.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I'll need something and I'll look for it. But last week I was cutting out a blacklight poster of a ghost ship made out of pink lines. Really elaborate. You can probably picture it from 1970. Mm-hmm. And I finished cutting it out, and I was looking at blacklight posters on the internet, and I found a blue version of the exact same one, and so I bought it. It was $99.
Is that a lot for your source material?
Well, that was a lot for that night. So the blue one's going to get superimposed with the pink one, I think. The identical drawings, but just different blacklight ink. So they're fabulous. I mean, they're just.
And will you show that under blacklight?
I don't know. I kind of thought about having some kind of supplemental light, and not just blacklight, but having something that would activate that ink.
And what about your color palette?
I always try to push the color. I'm really interested in color and the way that color works in juxtaposition with itself, and I think it's a magical language. There's feelings and emotions and physiological responses that come from color that you don't get any other way, and so color's a big emphasis.
And that again, is that an intuitive approach to the color?
I mean, I started doing collages 27 years ago or something like that. So there's a certain amount of intuition, but there's also a lot of practice.
Do you, do people come to you with source material that they think you're going to want, and it doesn't resonate at all with you?
Oh, no. Usually it's the other way around. Usually somebody will say, I've got these great books and you ought to come look at them, and I ignore them for the first 2 or 3 times that they contact me, and then they say, oh, well, there's Parrots of the World in this batch.
You have a thing for parrots, right?
Yeah, and I was over there the next day, and So yeah, a lot of really good stuff. People are insightful, and they look at my work and they see what I do, and they think, oh, well, this would work really well, and a lot of times it does.
Do people commission works?
Frequently.
And how is that working with the way you work? I mean, so are they asking you to do a certain kind of imagery, or a certain kind of subject, or a certain color, or all of the above?
Usually it's based on an image that's no longer available, and I'll do something that's the same theme, not an identical reproduction, but something that kind of goes with it.
So kind of a variation on an existing work.
Exactly.
Does that happen a lot?
Yeah.
And what about the scale? Because in the exhibition we have some very intimate, beautiful, intimate works, but we also have some sort of larger scaled works. How do you dictate this? What dictates the scale?
A lot of times the scale is dictated by the type of materials that I have and the amount of materials that I have. Sometimes the scale is driven by just the idea itself. I want to make a piece that's really big, and so I, get all the materials that I need to make that piece.
And the collages are glued down onto a panel, a wooden panel, a board?
Yeah, usually, because I use a water-based glue, and they would buckle.
Mm-hmm. But sometimes I noticed you've done collages on top of books or on other kind of surfaces.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah.
And so they become more dimensional, more like objects.
Yeah, and with the books, there's an implied content. Usually the books are sealed closed, and the titles are obscured.
Purposefully.
Yeah, so the content is kind of derived from the collage that's on the outside of the book, and that kind of, well, like I said, it's implied that there's content that echoes that inside the book.
I really love this, and that's why we're sitting on it for so long, because it's such a beautiful piece.
Thank you.
Now, I was also intrigued by your titles. Obviously, this is a pretty straightforward title, but what sort of drives the titles? Because some of them are a little more, kind of a little more symbolic. Some seem a little more esoteric.
Yeah, my favorite Jerry Seinfeld joke is, he said, somebody asked him where he got his jokes, and he said he hears a voice, but the voice is in German, so he has to get a translator. So they just pop in my head. Sometimes they're descriptive, and sometimes they're meant to mislead or offer an entry point into the piece. Maybe that's not the initial focal point.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know, for example, in the piece that we own, Funny Hat, it's part of from a children's book, and you can see that term, Funny Hat, like it was in the typography of the book.
Yeah.
But it's not the central image of that at all. It's like you have to really look for it to find it.
Yeah, sometimes they're that way.
So it's kind of like a game in a sense. You're like a little joke.
Yeah, that's a little joke.
So I think that there's. Do you see humor in your work?
All the time.
Do you think your audience sees that humor?
If they knew how I worked, they would.
Okay, what do you mean by that? You have to give us a little more there.
Well, it's like this, basically, for 6 hours a day. I don't know, a lot of the things that I use are, I use a lot of children's books because of the variations in typography and also the intensity of color, the reliance on color. Mm-hmm. And so little phrases pop out, and I use old advertising from the 40s and 50s, and you'll see interesting phrases that way too, and mm-hmm. I'll use those.
And what inspires you? Like, what in the world inspires you to make your art?
Well, this one I was thinking of actually flying, like flying over a garden and banking. So sometimes it's that I have a tray full of hedges, and I want to create a sense of space and a sense of light, and a space that you can go into.
Yes, because this one really pulls you into it. Some of them you're kind of observing, right? You're kind of standing on the outside observing, but this one is really pulling us into the architecture, of the space, right?
Yeah, because of the perspective lines of the hedges, it sends the eye back into the piece. A lot of the things that inspire me and drive me and make my work interesting to me are the formal issues. I don't always rely on a narrative, and I seldom start with a narrative, but generally I'll start with a compositional idea or a color idea or something about space and light, and just work from there. And if a narrative starts to develop, then I'll push that.
But that might evolve in the process of the formal.
Exactly.
So, I'm just curious about when you became interested in art. Did you make art as a kid? Is it something your parents encouraged, or did you come to it late in life?
I started drawing with a red Crayola on my crib when I was 4 years old. That's what my mother told me. And my mother was an art student at the University of Texas. So she would take classes, and I would get to go to the art building when I was quite young. She had art books and gave me art supplies for gift occasions, and I just always knew I was going to be an artist.
And so that was, from the beginning, that was your kind of visualize that yourself as an
Yeah,
artist?
she didn't really, she didn't pressure me or program me, but she gave me enough support and the materials that I needed to just develop. She was a very sensitive parent.
And did she develop her own work?
She got discouraged by some of her professors, and she stopped doing work mostly. She does little doodles, and now she does sewing. She does quilts and things like that. Mm-hmm. She's still creative.
So, a lot of artists are influenced by travel. That travel is very important to their kind of process of thinking and developing work, or the place they live, they are influenced. So I'm just curious, does Austin have any imprint or influence on you, or do you travel a lot out of Austin? Does that have some impact?
Yeah, I travel a lot because of shows, and sometimes things will creep in from other places, but we garden a lot, and we have a pretty big, our yard is pretty big, and we've been working on it for 15 years or 20 years, and so there's a lot going on in the backyard, and the idea of working on the yard inspires a lot of the garden pieces, I think. Mm-hmm.
And I kind of living with the work we have been for the last few months, I've sort of just become really enamored by the way you create these imaginary worlds. Sometimes they feel like utopian worlds. Sometimes they feel a little more dystopian. Could you talk about this idea of the imaginary world and how you see the worlds you're creating?
Yeah, early on, I kind of developed this idea about looking that was based on kind of a passive gaze, like looking at something and not really thinking about it, and just letting your eye wander through that pattern or whatever the scheme of the image is. And so some of the pieces, like this one in particular, are meant to be more meditative and longer lasting, so there's enough to see that you're not going to get everything for a long time.
So time is a very critical element in the work.
It's part of my strategy is to have the longevity of the pieces, yeah.
So the idea is that people would engage these and then kind of do a journey around through them, right? Over
See
the
different
surface.
things, different times. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've had that experience with art. The best art that I've seen, you always see something slightly different about mm-hmm. it whenever you look at it, and I aspire to that.
And I know that's just from bringing people through the space, giving tours of the show, that we're always finding new things in them. We're always finding like new hidden things. And then I think that's where your kind of humor comes out, because there's some kind of funny little in-jokes that you start to discover.
Yeah.
What about your kind of research process?
Research?
Mm-hmm. Do you do research?
I buy books and to cut up. So
Some people don't like cutting up books. They feel like it's a bad thing to do.
yeah, my sister's a librarian, and so we're like, we can't get together on vacations or anything.
She doesn't think you should be cutting up books, right?
That's the extent of my research. Like I know who, like Hans Melming does the best hands. So if I'm going to do a piece about hands, then I'll buy a couple of Hans Melming books. And lately I've been buying ornamental conifer books because I've been making these forests, kind of all green, dense forests. So the research is mostly about finding out what kind of imagery is available and how it was printed and what eras that printing was at a premium and most interesting. The lattice work on this one was from a 1946 Montgomery Ward's catalog that Montgomery Ward's lavished great expense on printing this catalog. The ink is sumptuous and beautiful, and the color, where there's color, is also really beautiful. But the black and white is kind of a sepia tone and saturated blacks. So it's a lot of it has to do with printing and just discovering things.
Do you go back and add color over? Like, do you go back in paint or anything, or is it the color we're seeing, the color of the printed material?
Right. Yeah, I don't paint. Sometimes I'll paint a flat colored background, but it's usually the same bright pink, and it's just to kind of make the color pop. Barely see any of it through the collage.
And do you work with any kind of digital imagery or anything like that? It's all just analog. It's all magazines and books and things you're cutting apart and pasting together. And could you see that going into a digital realm? Or is it partly that your hand has to be there?
Yeah, I kind of don't believe in doing digital collages. It's too, it's kind of like cheating in a way.
I don't think everybody will agree with that, but I want to shift from the collages to this. There are a couple of objects in the show, and I love these shoes. And could you talk a little about like moving from the two-dimensional surface to the objects, and how it draws you to these, and how do you decide which objects to cover and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I don't know. I've done 5 motorcycles. I built an airplane. I've done a lot of collages, bicycles. I don't know. The collages are about like folk dancing, sort of, to me, or a primitive, kind of walking. I don't know. I don't know how to articulate it really, what they mean or why I end up doing it, but the clogs really lend themselves to the imagery. So I keep coming back to that.
And what about tell us about the plane. You did a plane?
Yeah, I bought a 1946 Letscher Kaufman sailplane, which was a 50-foot wingspan, 22-foot fuselage that had been crashed. And it was a wooden and steel construction, mostly wood, exoskeleton with a steel frame kind of inner structure. And I cut it down and made it 19 feet by 12 feet, and I patterned it after a specific airplane that I knew about from when I was a kid that has a beautiful bird-like quality to it. And when I was growing up, we would go to parks and there would be an airplane from the Korean War that had been graffitied on a stand in the park, and that image just stuck in my head. And so when I started working on the airplane, that was the idea, was to create a graffitied airplane. So yeah, I built that.
And you said you did motorcycles, like full-scale motorcycles? It's like a real motorcycle that you were collaging over?
Real motorcycles, yeah, racing, mostly racing motorcycles, Grand Prix racing motorcycles. They have aerodynamic fairings, so they're made to be stable at really high speeds by the bodywork, and the bodywork also lends itself to the collage very well. It's graceful and it's airstream. You know, it's got this cool time signature. So most of them were that type of motorcycle, although I've done other motorcycles that were functional motorcycles.
And then you said bicycles as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, I'm hearing there's kind of a pattern here of all kind of methods of escape, including these shoes. All kind of. I'm thinking maybe you're trying to escape from something here.
No, I'm content.
No? Well, the shoes are also a method of moving, right? To travel.
Yeah, no, that's a good observation. I never thought of that. It's scary.
I also love, we have a few examples of your drawings. This one I feel is on a book,
Yeah.
on the cover of a book, or the inside, I guess maybe the inside cover of the book. Or,
No, it's on the outside.
okay.
Yeah.
And the drawings what I love about the drawings in contrast to the collages is that they're so linear and precise, and there's a kind of beautiful precision about them that's different from the collages. So your approach to and these are recent drawings, right? So is that something like the way you handle drawing is different from collages? Can you talk a little about that?
Well, this is a different type of drawing than the first drawings that you started out with,
Right.
in that it's a constructed drawing. I use an architect's scale, and I try to draw things in proportion to one another. Like those 2x4s are proportionally accurate 2x4s, and the ladder is a 6-foot ladder, and it's proportionally accurate to the 2x4s that are on the building. So it's more like drafting than drawing. And I've done a lot of drawings in that method, using that method.
Which it seems very, very different from the way the intuitive collages are made.
Yeah.
Because this is a real precise, as I
Yeah.
said, precision. There's something that's very thoughtful about each element here.
I built a lot of stuff. I was a carpenter when my grandparents were realtors, and so I learned how to do carpentry when I was a little kid. And I built a lot of stuff, and when I build things, I think it through in my head, make little sketches, and build it out of my head. And so these drawings are done the same way. They're kind of fleshed out in my mind and then drawn out of my head. It's a model. I did some architectural models, same thing, using a scale, so the proportions are correct. You know, there are 2x4s and 2x6s and 2x12s.
And we have a little painting trapped inside the house.
Yeah.
What is that about?
I don't know. It's kind of a little studio.
So we're going to open the floor up for questions, because I
Okay.
think probably we may have some questions from the audience. So we're going to put the lights up a bit, I think, and we have some. I think we have some guides with some microphones for people who have questions. So here we'll start. Yes, with you, right here in the front.
I saw the documentary they did on you, and I really enjoyed it. And I was wondering, two questions. What were your thoughts on it? And the second one was they talked about a large-scale, what was it, the drawing outside several of those in Austin? That's the second question.
No, there was just one. It was 8 by 16 feet, and it was a metal piece. So it was made out of tin, and the reason that I made it that was the first tin piece, and we were concerned about the weathering of the piece because it was going to get full-on sun and weathered throughout the year. And we thought that maybe it would be more durable than other choices of materials. And it was up for about a year, and then a building was built on the vacant lot facing the wall that it was on, and so the collectors took it back. And what I feel about the movie is that it's pretty personal, and I think if I was going to do it again, I would be a little bit less revealing of my personal life. But
When was it made?
2017.
Okay, so about 5 years ago, so more than that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's good. It's an honor to have a movie made about you. And my sons both, you know, they're like, man, you got a movie made out of you. You know, so it's...
Is it available on YouTube?
Yeah, it's on Amazon Prime, and
Okay.
You can buy copies on Amazon and YouTube.
What's the name of
eBay.
it?
But thank you for letting them do it. It was great into your art and the way you do it.
Thanks.
Here, up here?
Yeah, thanks. Early on, you weren't, oh, excuse me.
Thank you.
You didn't like signing your work, it seemed like. Have you changed your attitude towards signing your work?
They're all signed. They're signed on the back. I put the title and arrow pointing up, and the date and my signature on the back of the board. So the frames have a piece of foam core that covers the backing board, so you can't see any of that unless you unframe it. But they're all signed.
But you don't sign on the front.
No, I don't sign them on the front.
And don't you make your own frames?
Nope.
Oh,
No.
okay.
Thankfully, no.
All right, good.
No.
I have a question here in front.
Yeah, what kind of glue do you use?
I've used a lot of different kinds of glue, but the one that I like the best now is called Roman 880, and it's a commercial, ultra clear, strippable wallpaper adhesive. Commercial wallpaper adhesive.
So it doesn't bubble?
Doesn't bubble. It's real viscous, so it'll hold heavier material down without restrained drying. It's strippable means that you can soak it off. So if you decide you want to take something off of a collage, you can soak it in water for a little bit and peel it back off.
Does that happen sometimes?
No.
Oh. I didn't think so.
And you still press them?
Yeah, that's, I have book presses, and I have presses that I've made out of foam and wood, and I use big C-clamps to put pressure, and it creates an emboss and keeps everything stuck while the glue dries.
Do you glaze them after?
What?
Do you glaze the whole surface after with anything, or?
No, I use ultraviolet resistant plexiglass to protect the color and the paper. So that's how I deal with that.
I saw another question over here. Yes.
Of all the pieces of art that you have made, which one is your favorite
That I've made or that's in the show?
that you made?
Wow.
Because you've made thousands, right?
Yeah, I've made a lot of work. I don't know. Sometimes it's the piece that I'm working on at the time. You know, not quite finished yet. I feel the most excitement about that piece. There's certain pieces that, like when we were going through the slides, you know, there's certain pieces I like a lot. Like the one with all the water. It's called Magic Mountain. I like that one a lot. In the show, there's one called The Night Squirrel that's my favorite piece in the show. It's about a squirrel in our attic.
I think we had another question over here.
Hey Lance, thanks for being here today.
Yeah.
Do you ever find, when I'm doing collage, I worry that people will recognize the image? Is that why you use vintage materials, or how do you obscure the source of the image, or do you even try to do that?
Yeah. I've not used imagery that I really wanted to use because it's too well known. And a lot of times I will choose things to obscure the sources of, I'll use them in such a way as to obscure the source that they come from. And sometimes they're traceable, like you can look at something and, like I can look at this piece right here and I know that there's a gardening company called Wayfield Gardens, and I got all these catalogs from the 40s and 50s, and that's where all the floral imagery came from. So some of them I'll buy multiple copies because it's so good. I'll just keep using them and buy more copies.
And when you say that they're too well known, give an example of something that's like, what do you mean that's too well known?
Well, like I wouldn't use an Escher drawing.
Okay. Right, got it. Here, right here.
I'm interested in the process of how did you make the, how did you overcome the, I guess I'm looking at all this beautiful imagery and I'm thinking about how do you decide this is going to be cut out? Like, did you ever struggle with, like, God, this whole piece of paper is so beautiful by itself? How, like, at what point did you just decide, you know what, I'm just going to chop these pages up? And because I think there's some fear that can come out of, like, wrecking
Yeah.
a page.
There's so much material available that it's really just a question of finding it. And if I find something that's really particularly good, I'll buy multiple copies, and that's how I get around that.
And how many blades do you go through?
I go through a lot of blades. I change every 15 or 20 minutes, change a blade.
Okay, we have another question here.
What is your legal liability, and does anybody, any content owners ever come after you?
Because of copyright? Never. Never.
Is that a consideration, is that a worry with you?
Well, I mean, I don't like to plagiarize, per se, but I will.
Is that all you have to say on that? We got up here.
When it comes to the process of your collages, how do you handle mistake? Because I'm assuming once everything's glued down, it's difficult to start over.
Well, I lay them out without glue first, so there's a lot of opportunity for rearrangement and avoiding mistakes, but there's kind of really not really mistakes in a way. It's sort of just working with it until everything starts to click. And if I get pieces back, a lot of times they seem like they're obsolete or they don't seem as worked up as the work that I'm doing now, so I'll work on top of them.
Do you work on more than one piece at a time?
Yeah.
I think we had another question over here.
Yeah, do you ever alter your images? Like, I know with like National Geographic magazines, you could add like a solvent and it can get like acidic, or do you just always keep it, your images pure, just as is?
They're pretty much as found. I don't ever use National Geographic. I just, something about the quality of the printing isn't attractive to me. But I know what you mean, and I've been through phases in my career where I use caustic chemicals to alter imagery, but it's not really relevant with what I'm doing now.
Oh, yes.
Could you talk about the density of your work and what you're thinking, or is that something about the labor that you're involved in?
Well, lately they've been 5 or 6 or 7 layers thick, and a lot of stuff gets covered up. And I think that I want the detail to extend further than the eye can see. I want to be able to, I want somebody to be able to stand a couple of inches away from a piece and see detail that's submerged in the collage, and thereby giving it a greater lifespan. Just having more there than you can see at one time. I got criticized recently in a review that said that some of my work was grotesquely overworked, and so I've been kind of paring it back a little bit.
Did you agree to that?
No, not really. No, I hope it's not.
It looks like your more recent imagery is more nature-oriented than your stuff in the past. Is some of that pandemic-oriented? Has that affected any of you?
Not so much. It's mostly color. Yeah, I think, and availability of materials, the type of materials that I've been able to find. Like all the water from this piece is 40 by 60 inches. It's about that big, and all the water came from sailing ships, lithographs of sailing ships from the 50s or 40s or 60s. So I collected sailing ship lithographs for a year and got enough water to make a bunch of pieces because I knew I wanted to make water pieces. But the thing that really gets me about this piece isn't that it's representative of the ocean or water or whatever. It's the color of the water. The color is really, intense and beautiful.
So if you work alone 6 hours a day and you have all your source material delivered to you, it doesn't sound like the pandemic had much of an effect on your practice, right?
No, I've been socially isolating for 30 years.
There was a question here, yes.
Some of your work has a more three-dimensional aspect to it where you're mounting images, cutting around them, and creating depth in at least certain pieces. And then some are just two-dimensional. Can you speak a little bit about what motivates you to bring them into the third dimension? And, for those of us that are attracted to that, do you plan on doing more of the dimensional work?
Like the optical illusion of space is very important. It's a great entry point into the collages. If there's a sense of space, either because of perspective lines or superimposition or changes in scale, or that's a good way to get somebody to look at it for a couple of seconds more. And once they look for 3 seconds, then they might look for 7 seconds, and then they may look for longer still because they find other things. As far as the differentiating between 2- and 3-dimensional aspects in my work, I don't consciously really do that too much. Like if something seems like it's going together in a real simple way, then I'll leave it simple. And if it's just taking a lot of material and absorbing it and it's not looking right, then I'll keep adding things to it until it starts to feel right.
Yes.
My question is, what is the most important thing to do in a collage?
To do in a collage?
Yes.
Create light and space.
Light and space. There was a question way up at the top.
You started, can you hear me?
Yes.
So you started discussing about just the color here and not the water, which I thought was very insightful. Do you mind talking about what else you were seeing or thinking when you were doing this piece?
Well, the juxtaposition of the red and the blue You know, it's just the range of the color, I think, and the purple on the lower right-hand corner, how that activates, you know, it's like it pulls the whole range of color even further, extends it. I don't know. There's a good sense of movement. There's a good sense of space. There's mountains in the lower left-hand side that give you a sense of depth that's kind of like contradicted by the water pressing forward. So I think compositionally there's a lot that's going on that's interesting in this piece. And not much of it has to do with the representation of flowers floating on the water.
So we may have time for one more question if anybody has one last question. Yes, over here.
What type of blades do you like to use, and have the mass quantities that you stop using ended up in your work, or do you plan to ever use them?
I keep them. I've got 5 jars, about those big pickle jars. I've got 5 jars of blades, and I use Excel blades. They're double honed. They're sharper, and they stay sharper than X-Acto blades.
I see you have a bandage on your finger. Do you cut yourself a lot?
Not intentionally.
But on occasion. Okay. Well, I want to thank you for all you offered us tonight.
Yeah, sure.
We have signed copies of one of Lance's children's books available in our boutique if you're interested in that after. And also, please join us for having a small reception outside of the lecture hall in the breezeway, the lobby out here. So please join us right after. Thank you. Thank you all.